Who is unknown, Olivia? I asked before I could stop myself, my voice quieter than I expected but sharper than I intended, and she froze mid-step, her phone still glowing in her hand, her eyes flicking to mine for a split second before she turned the screen away like it burned her, and that single movement hit me harder than any confession ever could because Olivia Carter, my wife, the woman who used to laugh too loud at my dumb jokes and fall asleep on my shoulder during late-night movies, had never hidden anything from me before, not like that, not with that quick, guilty reflex that made my chest tighten, and she forced a small smile and said, "It's nothing, Jason, just work stuff." But her voice didn't land right, it felt rehearsed like she had said those words somewhere else before saying them to me, and I tried to laugh it off, I really did, because I wasn't the kind of guy who jumped to conclusions. I trusted her, I trusted us, so I shrugged and said, "Work stuff doesn't usually come from unknown contacts." And she rolled her eyes just a little too quickly and replied, "You're overthinking again," and I nodded like I agreed like I always did, but something inside me didn't settle this time, something stayed awake, watching, listening, waiting, and I told myself I was being stupid, that people get random messages all the time, that names don't always mean anything. But later that night when she went to the kitchen and left her phone on the couch beside me, the screen lit up again and I didn't mean to look, I swear I didn't, but my eyes moved before my brain could stop them, and I saw it clearly this time. "Miss you already." Tonight felt too short, and my heart dropped so fast it felt like I missed a step in the dark, and I just stared at the message, my mind trying to twist it into something harmless, something explainable, but there was no version of work that sounded like that, no late meeting that ended with someone saying they missed her already, and I whispered to myself, no, that's not what this is. But the words felt weak even as I said them, and when she came back into the room I quickly looked away, pretending I hadn't seen anything, pretending my world hadn't just shifted slightly out of place, and she sat beside me close enough that I could smell her perfume, the same one I bought her last anniversary, and she leaned her head on my shoulder like everything was normal and asked, "You okay?" And I forced a small smile and said, "Yeah, just tired," and she nodded like she believed me, or maybe like she wanted to believe me, and we sat there in silence, the kind of silence that used to feel comfortable but now felt heavy, like something unsaid was sitting between us, and I finally asked, trying to keep my voice steady, "How late were you at work today?" And she hesitated just for a second, but I noticed everything now, and she said, "Just the usual, you know how it is," and I nodded again, playing along even though my mind was replaying that message over and over, "Miss you already," and I couldn't stop thinking, who says that after a meeting, who says that to someone else's wife, and I wanted to ask her directly, I wanted to say, "Olivia, are you lying to me?" But the words wouldn't come out because saying them would make it real, and I wasn't ready for that, so instead I said, "You've been working a lot lately," and she sighed like she had been waiting for that line and replied, "It's just a busy season, Jason, it'll calm down soon," and I looked at her, really looked at her, at the way she avoided my eyes just a little, at the way her fingers kept tapping against her leg like she was restless, and I asked softly, "You're not stressed or anything, right?" And she shook her head quickly and said, "No, I'm fine, why would you even ask that?" And I shrugged and said, "I don't know, you just feel different." And she pulled away slightly and crossed her arms, and her tone shifted just enough for me to feel it when she said, "People change, Jason, it doesn't mean something's wrong." And I felt that line hit deeper than it should have. Because it sounded like more than just an answer, it sounded like a warning, like a distance she had already created between us, and I swallowed and said, "Yeah, I guess," even though I didn't agree, even though everything inside me was screaming that something was wrong, that something was breaking right in front of me, and I was just sitting there pretending not to see it. And later that night, when she fell asleep beside me, I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing, trying to match it with the girl I used to know, the girl who would tell me everything without me asking, and I whispered quietly, "Please don't lie to me," even though she couldn't hear me, even though I wasn't sure if I wanted her to, and my mind kept going back to that name, unknown, and I thought, maybe it's nothing, maybe I'm just tired, maybe I'm letting one message ruin everything, and I held on to that thought like it was the only thing keeping me calm, like if I believed it hard enough, it would become true. And the next morning, when she smiled at me like nothing had happened and kissed my cheek before leaving for work, I told myself, "Trust her, don't ruin this over nothing," and I watched her walk out the door, her heels clicking softly against the floor, and for a moment, everything looked normal again, but as soon as the door closed, that feeling came back, stronger this time, heavier, like a crack spreading through something that used to be solid, and I sat there alone, and said under my breath, "It's just in my head," even though deep down I already knew it wasn't. And that was the moment I made a quiet decision, not to confront her, not to accuse her, not yet, but to watch, to wait, and to find out the truth, because something inside me had already started breaking, and I couldn't pretend I didn't feel it anymore. "Why do you smell different?" I asked the moment Olivia stepped inside, and even as the words left my mouth, I hated how desperate they sounded, but I couldn't stop myself anymore, not after nights of silence and mornings full of fake smiles. And she paused mid-step, keys still in her hand, then forced a laugh that didn't reach her eyes and said, "It's called perfume, Jason." And I shook my head slowly and replied, "That's not your perfume." And she rolled her eyes and walked past me like I was being ridiculous, like I was the problem, and that hurt more than anything because I wasn't imagining this, I knew I wasn't, and I followed her into the living room and said, "You've been coming home late every night, same time, same excuse, same smile." And she turned around sharply and said, "So now I need to report my schedule to you?" And I raised my hands slightly and said, "No, I just need honesty." And she scoffed and replied, "You're overthinking again." And that word again hit me hard because it was always that. Overthinking, never the truth, never an explanation that made sense, just dismissal, just distance. And I looked at her and said quietly, "Olivia, talk to me." And she looked away, grabbing her phone, and said, "I'm tired, Jason, not everything is a problem." And I watched her walk toward the bedroom and something inside me twisted because that wasn't how we used to be. We used to talk about everything, even the small things, even the stupid things, and now it felt like I was talking to a stranger wearing her face. And later that night, I sat alone on the couch, staring at my phone, debating whether to call Ryan, and after a long silence I finally did, and he picked up on the third ring and said, "Yo, what's up?" And I hesitated before saying, "I need your opinion on something," and he laughed lightly and replied, "That sounds serious," and I forced a weak smile and said, "It is," and then I told him everything, not every detail, not the message itself, but enough for him to understand the feeling, the doubt, the shift in Olivia. And he went quiet for a moment before saying, "You sure you're not just stressed?" And I closed my eyes and said, "That's what I thought at first." And he added, "Look, relationships go through phases, man, maybe she's just busy." And I nodded even though he couldn't see me and said, "Yeah, maybe," but his answer didn't calm me, it didn't fix anything, it just added another layer of confusion because if I wasn't overthinking, then what was this? And after the call ended, I sat there thinking, maybe I am the problem, maybe I'm reading too much into things, but then the image of that message flashed in my mind again and I whispered, "No, that wasn't normal." And the next day, I decided to stop guessing and start asking. So when Olivia came home again later than usual, I stood up before she could walk past me and said, "Who is Daniel Brooks?" And her entire body stiffened for just a second before she masked it and said, "Coworker." And I stepped closer and asked, "Just a coworker?" And she frowned slightly and replied, "What does that even mean?" And I looked straight at her and said, "It means I want the truth." And she crossed her arms and said, "You're being ridiculous." And I shook my head and said, "Then explain why his name keeps popping up." And her eyes flashed with something I couldn't read, maybe anger, maybe fear, and she said, "We work together, Jason, of course his name comes up." And I exhaled slowly and replied, "Work doesn't send messages like that." And she froze again, and that silence confirmed more than her words ever could, and she quickly said, "You went through my phone?" And I answered honestly, "I saw a message," and she threw her hands up and said, "Unbelievable," like I was the one who crossed a line, like I was the one who broke something, and I felt my chest tighten as I said, "I'm trying to fix this before it breaks completely," and she shook her head and said, "There's nothing to fix," and that sentence echoed in my head because it sounded final, like she had already decided something I wasn't part of. And I stepped back slightly and asked, "Do you even hear yourself?" And she grabbed her bag and said, "I'm not doing this tonight," and walked away again, leaving me standing there with questions that only grew louder. And later, I found myself at a small cafe across from her office, waiting for Daniel Brooks to show up because if she wouldn't give me answers, maybe he would. And when I saw him walk in, confident, relaxed, like someone who had nothing to hide, I stood up and approached him and said, "Daniel Brooks?" And he looked at me slightly confused and said, "Yeah?" And I extended my hand and said, "Jason Carter, Olivia's husband," and his expression changed just enough for me to notice, just enough to confirm something wasn't right, and he shook my hand and said, "Oh, nice to meet you," and I smiled faintly and said, "Mind if we talk?" And he hesitated before saying, "Sure," and we sat down and I looked him straight in the eye and asked, "What's going on between you and Olivia?" And he leaned back slightly and said, "What do you mean?" And I replied, "I mean don't insult me with lies." And he held my gaze for a moment before saying, "We work together," and I shook my head and said, "That's not what I'm asking," and he sighed and said, "Look man, I think you're misunderstanding things," and I felt something inside me snap. Just a little as I said, "Then help me understand," and he looked away briefly and said, "There's nothing to explain," and that answer, that calm, controlled denial, felt worse than any confession because it was too clean, too practiced, and I stood up slowly and said, "If there's nothing to explain, Then there's nothing to hide, right? And he didn't answer, and that silence followed me all the way home, growing heavier with every step, until I walked into my apartment and saw Olivia sitting there like nothing had happened, like we weren't falling apart piece by piece, and I looked at her and said quietly, "I'm done guessing." And she looked up, confused, and asked, "What does that mean?" And I took a deep breath and said, "It means I need proof." And she frowned and said, "Proof of what?" And I met her eyes and replied, "The truth." And for the first time she didn't have an answer, and in that silence I made my decision. Not based on fear, not based on doubt, but on certainty. That something was wrong, and I whispered to myself later that night, "No more feelings, no more guessing," and my hands tightened as I said it again, stronger this time, "I need proof." "Another late meeting tonight," Olivia said while fixing her hair in the mirror, her tone casual, practiced, like she had said it 100 times before, and I stood behind her watching her reflection instead of her, searching for something real in her eyes, and I asked quietly, "Same office?" And she nodded without hesitation and replied, "Yeah, big client, might be late," and I forced a small smile and said, "Drive safe." But inside, everything felt wrong, heavier than before, louder than before, and as she grabbed her bag and walked toward the door I said, "Olivia," and she paused, looking back, and I hesitated for just a second before asking, "You sure everything's okay?" And she smiled softly, almost convincingly, and said, "Of course it is," and then she left, the door closing behind her with a soft click that echoed louder than it should have, and I stood there staring at the door, my chest tight, my mind racing, and I whispered to myself, "Then why does it feel like everything is falling apart?" And before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed my keys and followed her, my hands slightly shaking as I got into my car, and I told myself, "This is crazy, this isn't me," but I started the engine anyway because not knowing was worse than anything I might see, and I kept a distance as I drove behind her through the Los Angeles streets, the city lights blurring slightly as my focus shifted between her car and the storm inside my head, and I muttered under my breath, "Just go to work. Please just go to work," like I could will it into reality, like I could fix everything before it broke completely. But then she took a turn she never took before, and my grip on the steering wheel tightened as I said, "That's not the way to your office," and my heart started beating faster, louder, almost drowning out everything else, and I followed anyway, each turn pulling me deeper into something I didn't want to face. And when she finally slowed down and parked near a quiet restaurant tucked between two dimly lit buildings, my breath caught, and I whispered, "No, no, this isn't happening." But it was right in front of me, undeniable, and I parked a short distance away, my hands gripping the wheel as I watched her step out of the car, adjusting her coat, looking around briefly like she was making sure no one noticed, and that small detail cut deeper than anything because it meant she knew. She knew this wasn't something she wanted seen, and I stepped out of my car slowly, staying far enough to not be noticed, and I said quietly, "What are you doing, Olivia?" Even though she couldn't hear me, and I followed her with my eyes as she walked into the restaurant, disappearing behind the glass door, and for a moment, everything went silent, like the world paused just to let this moment sink in, and I stood there, frozen between going in and walking away, and I told myself, "You don't have to see this, you can still turn back." But my feet didn't move because deep down I already knew the answer, I just needed to see it, and I positioned myself where I could look through the window without being seen, my heart pounding as I searched for her inside. And then I found her, sitting at a table near the corner, her posture relaxed, her face softer than it had been with me in weeks, and I felt something inside me crack as I whispered, "Why do you look happier here?" And then the door opened again and another man walked in, confident, calm, like he belonged there, and my stomach dropped as I watched him approach her table, and when she looked up at him, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a long time, and I clenched my jaw as I said, "Who is he?" Even though I already knew, even though the answer had been building inside me for days, and he sat down across from her, leaning slightly forward, and she mirrored him, their movements natural, easy, like this wasn't new, like this wasn't the first time, and I felt my chest tighten. As I said, "Daniel?" But then I realized, no, this wasn't Daniel Brooks, this was someone else, someone new, someone I had never seen before, and that realization hit even harder because it meant this was bigger than I thought, deeper than I imagined. And I watched them closely, every small movement, every glance, every smile, and I whispered, "Say something, give me a reason this isn't what it looks like." But they didn't, because their silence said everything, the way her hand moved slightly across the table, the way he didn't pull away, the way they both leaned closer like the rest of the world didn't exist, and I felt my breathing grow uneven as I said, "Olivia, how long?" And I wanted to walk in, I wanted to grab her hand and pull her away, demand answers, demand the truth. But I stayed where I was, rooted in place, because something told me this wasn't the moment to act, this was the moment to see, to understand. And as I watched them talk, their lips moving in quiet. Conversation I couldn't hear. I started noticing things I didn't want to notice, the way she smiled differently, the way she touched her hair, the way she leaned in just a little too close, and I whispered, "This isn't just work. This isn't just a mistake." And my chest felt tight, like something heavy was pressing down on me, and I realized then that what I was seeing wasn't confusion, it wasn't uncertainty, it was comfort, familiarity, something built over time, something real, and that hurt. More than anything, because it meant this wasn't new, this wasn't sudden, this had been happening right in front of me while I chose to trust, while I chose to believe, and I felt my hands curl into fists as I said, "You lied to me," my voice barely audible even to myself, and then I saw it, the moment that made everything clear, the moment that erased every doubt I still held on to. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his, not hesitating, not pulling back, just resting there. Like it belonged, and he turned his hand slightly, holding hers in return, and I felt something inside me break completely as I whispered, "No," because that wasn't accidental, that wasn't friendly, that wasn't anything but real, undeniable, and I stepped back slowly, my vision slightly blurred as I tried to process everything, and I said to myself, "This isn't just emotional, this isn't just talking." And the realization hit me harder than anything before, heavier, sharper, final, and I looked back at them one last time, their hands still together, their faces close, their worlds separate from mine, and I said quietly, "This is something else, something I didn't see coming," and I turned away, my steps unsteady as I walked back toward my car, my mind racing, my heart shattered, and as I opened the door and sat inside, I gripped the steering wheel and said, "This changes everything," because deep down I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I stood just outside the restaurant, my hand hovering near the door handle, my chest rising and falling like I had just run miles, and I whispered to myself, "Just walk in, just ask her," but my fingers didn't move because something inside me said, "Wait, listen first," and I stepped slightly closer to the glass, just enough to hear fragments of their voices through the small opening near the frame, and Marcus's voice came first, calm and steady, "You're sure he doesn't suspect anything?" And my heart skipped as I froze in place, and Olivia replied without hesitation, "Jason suspects everything but understands nothing," and I felt that sentence hit me like a punch, sharp and direct, and I whispered under my breath, "That's what you think?" But I stayed quiet, forcing myself to listen even as my chest tightened, and Marcus leaned slightly forward and said, "Good, because timing matters, we can't rush this." And Olivia nodded and replied, "I know, I've been careful," and I clenched my jaw as I said silently, "Careful about what?" and Marcus continued, "And the accounts?" And Olivia lowered her voice slightly, but I still caught it, "I've already started moving things slowly, nothing that would alert him," and my grip tightened against the wall as I said quietly, "Accounts? What accounts?" And Marcus smiled faintly and said, "Smart, very smart," and Olivia leaned back slightly, her tone softer, almost proud, "He trusts me completely, that makes it easy," and I closed my eyes for a second as those words sank in, because she wasn't just lying to me, she was using my trust like it was nothing, like it was a tool, and Marcus added, "Once everything is in place, you won't need him anymore," and my breath caught as Olivia responded, "I already don't need him," and that sentence broke something deeper than anything else, something final, something I couldn't fix, and I whispered, "So that's it, that's all I am now," and Marcus reached for her hand again and said, "We just have to play this right, no mistakes," and Olivia nodded and said, "I've been playing this right from the start," and I felt my stomach twist as I realized this wasn't recent, this wasn't a mistake, this was planned, calculated, and I leaned slightly closer, ignoring the pounding in my chest, and Marcus continued, "And the property?" And Olivia replied, "Still in both names, but once the transfer is done, it won't matter," and I whispered, "Transfer?" as my mind tried to catch up with everything I was hearing, and Marcus said, "Good, because once that's settled, everything else falls into place," and Olivia smiled faintly and said, "He won't see it coming," and I almost laughed at that, not because it was funny but because it was true, I hadn't seen it coming, not like this, not this deep, not this deliberate, and Marcus leaned in slightly and asked, "Any emotional hesitation?" And Olivia shook her head without even thinking and said, "No, Jason and I, that's already over." And those words echoed in my head louder than anything else, because she didn't say maybe, she didn't say confused, she said over, like it had been decided long ago, and I whispered, "When did that happen?" Even though I knew I would never get that answer, and Marcus smiled and said, "Then we're almost there," and Olivia replied softly, "Almost," and there was a moment of silence between them, comfortable, natural, like they were building something together while I stood outside losing everything, and Marcus added, "You deserve better than him anyway," and Olivia let out a small breath and said, "I know," and I felt something inside me go cold at that point, not shattered, not broken, just cold, like the pain had burned through everything else and left something different behind, something sharper, and I whispered, "You know?" as I stared through the glass at the woman I thought I knew, and for the first time, I didn't see hesitation in her, I didn't see guilt, I saw certainty, and that changed everything, because if she wasn't unsure, then there was nothing left to save. And Marcus continued, "Once this is done, we can finally stop hiding," and Olivia nodded and said, "I'm tired of hiding," and I stepped back slowly, my heart still pounding but my mind clearer than it had been in days, because now I knew, now I understood, this wasn't about love anymore, this was about control, about planning, about taking everything from me while I stood there believing everything was fine. And I whispered to myself, "You planned all of this," and I felt my hands relax slightly, not because I felt better but because something inside me had shifted, something had woken up, and I looked at them one last time, their faces close, their voices low, their future already being built on top of my life, and I said quietly, "Not yet. I'm not done yet," and I turned away from the window, each step steady, controlled, even though my chest still ached, even though my heart still hurt. But I wasn't going to walk in there, I wasn't going to give them the scene they expected, the reaction they were prepared for, because they thought I didn't know, they thought I was blind, and that was their biggest mistake. And as I reached my car, I paused for a moment, looking back at the restaurant, and I said under my breath, "You think I won't see it coming? You're wrong." And I got inside, my hands steady now, my thoughts sharper, and I added quietly, "I just needed the truth." And as I started the engine, I knew one thing for certain, I wasn't going to confront them tonight, I wasn't going to react, not yet, because this wasn't just betrayal anymore, this was something bigger, something deeper, something that required more than emotion. And as I drove away, I whispered one last time, "Not yet." "I'm fine," I said the next morning when Olivia looked at me a little too carefully over breakfast, and I made sure my voice sounded light, almost bored, like nothing inside me had changed, like I hadn't stood outside a restaurant the night before and watched my entire life fall apart. And she narrowed her eyes slightly and asked, "You sure?" And I shrugged, taking a sip of coffee, and replied, "Yeah, just thinking about work." And she studied me for a second longer before nodding slowly and saying, "Okay," and I smiled faintly and added, "Why? You expecting something else?" And she quickly shook her head and said, "No, just, you seem different." And I leaned back in my chair and said calmly, "People change, Olivia, remember?" And I saw it then, that flicker in her eyes, that brief confusion, because I had just used her own words against her, and she didn't know what to do with it, and that gave me a strange sense of control, something I hadn't felt in days. And I stood up, grabbing my keys, and said, "I'll be late tonight." And she blinked and asked, "Late? Since when?" And I smirked slightly and replied, "Busy season." And then I walked out before she could say anything else, leaving her sitting there with questions instead of answers. And as soon as I got into my car, the smile faded, replaced by something sharper, something colder, and I whispered to myself, "No more reactions, just results." And I pulled out my phone and dialed the number I had saved earlier, and when the call connected, a calm female voice answered, "Sophia Lane?" And I said, "I need a lawyer." And there was a pause before she replied, "That depends on what kind of situation you're in." And I took a slow breath and said, "My wife is planning something behind my back, and I need to make sure I don't lose everything." And her tone shifted slightly, more focused now, as she asked, "Do you have proof?" And I answered honestly, "Not yet." And she said, "Then that's where we start." And I nodded even though she couldn't see me and said, "I'll do whatever it takes." And she replied, "Good, because whatever this is, you need to move carefully." And I agreed, "I know." And she added, "Come to my office this afternoon." And I said, "I'll be there." And when the call ended, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror and said quietly, "You should have just been honest with me." But that version of me, the one who wanted honesty, felt distant now, replaced by someone who wanted answers, control, and something else I wasn't ready to name yet. And later that day, I sat across from Sophia Lane in her office, her expression calm but sharp, and she said, "Start from the beginning." And I told her everything, not emotionally, not like before, but clearly, piece by piece. And when I finished, she leaned back slightly and said, "If what you're saying is true, then this isn't just personal, this is strategic." And I nodded and replied, "That's what it feels like." And she tapped her pen lightly and said, "Then you need evidence, messages, financial records, anything that shows intent." And I asked, "How do I get that without tipping her off?" And she smiled slightly and said, "That's where someone like Kevin Ross comes in." And I frowned slightly and asked, "Who?" And she replied, "Private investigator, discreet, efficient." And I leaned forward and said, "Set it up." And she nodded and said, "I'll have him contact you." And as I stood up to leave, she added, "One more thing." And I paused, looking back, and she said, "Whatever you're feeling, don't let it control your next move." And I gave a small nod and replied, "It won't." because for the first time I actually meant it, and that evening my phone rang again and a deep voice said, "Kevin Ross," and I said, "Jason Carter," and he got straight to the point. "Sophia told me enough. What exactly do you need?" And I replied, "I need everything, where she goes, who she meets, what she's hiding." And he paused for a second before saying, "You're asking for the truth, not comfort." And I answered firmly, "Exactly," and he said, "Then don't expect it to be easy," and I said, "It already isn't," and he let out a short breath and replied, "I'll start tonight," and I said, "Good," and when the call ended I leaned back in my chair and whispered, "Now we see how deep this goes," and when I got home later Olivia was already there, sitting on the couch, her phone in her hand, and she looked up as I walked in and said, "You're late," and I shrugged casually and replied, "Work?" and she studied me again and said, "You've been saying that a lot," and I smiled slightly and said, "Funny, so have you?" and she looked away for a moment before asking, "Is something going on?" and I walked past her and said calmly, "No," and she followed me with her eyes and said, "You're acting strange," and I stopped, turning just enough to look at her and replied, "Maybe I just stopped pretending," and she frowned slightly and asked, "Pretending what?" and I held her gaze for a second before saying, "That everything is perfect," and then I walked into the kitchen, leaving her in silence, and I could feel it, the shift, the uncertainty in her now, the way she couldn't read me anymore, and that gave me an edge I didn't have before, and over the next few days I kept playing the same role, calm, distant, controlled, while Kevin worked in the background, and each update he sent me added another piece to the puzzle, and one night, as I sat alone in my car, my phone buzzed with a new message from him, and I opened it slowly, my eyes scanning the details, and I whispered, "No way," because the timestamps, the locations, the frequency, it wasn't weeks, it wasn't even just recent, it had been going on for months, carefully hidden, carefully planned, and I leaned back, staring at the screen and said quietly, "You didn't just betray me, you built this," and for the first time, I felt something stronger than pain, something colder, more focused, and I tightened my grip on the phone and said, "Now it's my turn." "I know everything now," I said quietly to myself as I stared at the documents spread across my desk, and for the first time the confusion was gone, replaced by something sharp and clear, because this wasn't just betrayal anymore, this was a plan, a carefully built trap designed to leave me with nothing, and I picked up my phone and called David Cole, and as soon as he answered he said, "Jason, you sound serious," and I replied, "I need you to check something for me," and he asked, "What kind of something?" and I took a breath and said, "Company accounts, recent transfers, anything unusual tied to Olivia Carter," and there was a pause before he said, "That's specific," and I answered, "Just do it," and he didn't argue, he just said, "Give me an hour," and hung up, and I leaned back, whispering, "Let's see how deep this goes," and a few hours later my phone rang again, and David's voice was different this time, more serious, "Jason, there are transfers," and my jaw tightened as I asked, "How many?" and he replied, "Enough to matter, small amounts spread out but consistent," and I closed my eyes for a second and said, "She was careful," and he added, "Careful doesn't mean invisible," and I nodded slowly and said, "Send me everything," and when the call ended I looked down at the files Kevin Ross had already sent me, the timelines, the locations, the meetings, and I whispered, "You really thought I wouldn't notice?" And just then another message came through, this time from Kevin, and I opened it immediately, scanning the details, and I said under my breath, "Meetings, transfers, calls, all connected," and I leaned forward, feeling something steady build inside me, something controlled, and I said, "You're not just cheating, you're planning to take everything," and I stood up, grabbing my jacket because I needed one more piece, one more confirmation, and I knew exactly where to get it, and later that afternoon I found myself sitting across from Laura Bennett at a small cafe, and she smiled politely and said, "It's been a while, Jason," and I returned the smile and said, "Yeah, it has," and she tilted her head slightly and asked, "Everything okay with you and Olivia Carter?" And I watched her carefully as I replied, "Why would you ask that?" and she hesitated for a second before saying, "No reason, just, she's been different lately," and I leaned in slightly and said, "Different how?" and she shrugged lightly and said, "More secretive, I guess, always on her phone, always meeting someone," and my eyes locked onto hers as I asked, "Someone?" and she nodded casually, unaware of what she was confirming, "Yeah, Marcus Reed, I think she talks about him a lot," and I kept my expression neutral as I said, "Work stuff?" and Laura let out a small laugh and replied, "That's what she says, but it doesn't sound like work," and I felt that piece fall into place, solid and undeniable, and I said softly, "Does she ever mention me?" and Laura looked a little uncomfortable before saying, "Sometimes," and I asked, "What does she say?" and she hesitated again before answering, "That things aren't the same anymore," and I nodded slowly and said, "Anything else?" and she shook her head and said, "That's all I know," and I leaned back, finishing my coffee, and said, "That's more than enough," and she looked at me curiously and asked, "Jason, is something going on?" And I gave a small, controlled smile and said, "Not for long," and then I stood up and left because I had what I needed, and as I walked outside I pulled out my phone and called Sophia Lane, and she answered quickly, "Tell me you have something," and I said, "I have everything," and she replied, "Good, then we move to the next phase," and I asked, "Which is?" and she said, "Protection first, then exposure," and I nodded and said, "I've already started," and she paused for a second before saying, "You sound different," and I replied, "I am," and she said, "Good. Stay that way," and when the call ended I sat in my car looking at the city around me and I whispered, "Your move is over," and that night when I got home Olivia was waiting, sitting on the couch, her arms crossed, and she said, "We need to talk," and I raised an eyebrow slightly and replied, "About what?" and she stood up, stepping closer, and said, "You've been acting strange," and I shrugged and said, "You noticed?" and she frowned and replied, "Stop doing that," and I tilted my head slightly and asked, "Doing what?" and she said, "Acting like everything is normal when it's not," and I smiled faintly and said, "That's funny, I was thinking the same thing," and she looked at me, trying to read me, trying to figure out what I knew, but I gave her nothing, just calm, just control, and she finally said, "Are you hiding something from me?" and I let out a quiet breath and replied, "No," and then I added, "Are you?" and she froze for just a second before saying, "Of course not," and I nodded slowly and said, "Good," and I walked past her, leaving her standing there with that same uncertainty she had been giving me for weeks, and as I entered the bedroom I pulled out my phone, opening the files again, the proof, the plan, the betrayal, and I whispered, "Everything you built. I'm about to take it apart," and I sat down on the edge of the bed, my mind running through every step, every move, every detail, and I said quietly, "No mistakes now," because this wasn't just about catching them anymore, this was about ending it on my terms, and as I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, I added one final thought, "Let's see how your perfect plan holds up when I'm the one controlling the outcome." "Everyone's here, right?" I said quietly to David Cole as I adjusted my jacket, scanning the room filled with soft lights, polished glasses, and voices that sounded normal, like nothing was about to break apart, and David nodded slightly and replied, "Clients, partners, friends, even Olivia Carter invited a few people," and I smiled faintly and said, "Good," because that was exactly what I needed, the right audience, the right moment, the right silence before the truth, and as I stepped further into the room I saw her. Olivia Carter, standing beside Marcus Reed, her hand lightly resting near his arm like it belonged there, and she looked up, noticing me, and her expression shifted for just a second before she forced a smile and said, "Jason, you made it?" and I walked toward her calmly and replied, "Wouldn't miss it," and Marcus looked at me with that same composed confidence and said, "Good to see you," and I held his gaze for a moment and said, "Yeah, you too," and Olivia glanced between us and asked, "Everything okay?" and I nodded slightly and said, "Everything's perfect," and I could tell she didn't believe that, but she didn't push further, not yet, and as the room settled and people gathered closer for the evening announcements I stepped forward, raising my glass slightly and saying, "Before we continue I'd like a moment," and the room quieted slowly, curious, and Olivia's voice cut in quickly, "Jason, what are you doing?" and I turned to her calmly and said, "Telling the truth," and her face lost color almost instantly, and Marcus stepped forward slightly and said, "This isn't the place," and I smiled faintly and replied, "This is exactly the place," and I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone and said, "I've been quiet for a long time, trusting, believing, but tonight I think everyone deserves to see what trust looks like when it's broken," and Olivia shook her head quickly and said, "Jason, stop," and I looked at her and asked softly, "Why?" and she stepped closer, lowering her voice, "We can talk about this at home," and I tilted my head slightly and replied, "We had weeks to talk," and then I turned back to the room and said clearly, "This is Olivia Carter, my wife," and I paused, letting that settle before adding, "And this is Marcus Reed," and I glanced at him briefly before continuing, "The man she's been meeting behind my back," and the room shifted instantly, whispers rising, tension spreading, and Marcus's voice cut in sharply, "That's not what this is," and I raised a hand slightly and said, "Then explain it," and he stayed silent, his jaw tightening, and I tapped my phone, projecting the messages onto the screen behind me, the words clear, undeniable, and I read aloud, "Miss you already, tonight felt too short," and I let the silence grow heavier before adding, "That's not business," and Olivia stepped forward, her voice shaking, "Jason, please," and I looked at her and said, "Or this one? Once everything is in place you won't need him anymore," and her face went pale as she whispered, "You don't understand," and I let out a quiet breath and replied, "Then help me understand," and she shook her head, tears forming. "It's not what it looks like," and I laughed softly, not out of humor but disbelief, and said, "It looks like betrayal, it sounds like betrayal. So tell me what part I'm missing." And Marcus stepped in again, his voice tense. "You're twisting things," and I met his gaze and said, "Am I?" And I tapped the screen again, bringing up the financial records, and continued, "Because these transfers, small, careful, repeated, they tell a different story," and the room fell completely silent now, every eye on us, and Olivia's voice broke slightly as she said, "Jason, stop this," and I shook my head slowly and replied, "No. I've already stopped pretending," and she stepped closer, her hands trembling. "We can fix this," and I looked at her for a long moment before asking, "Fix what?" and she whispered, "Us," and I held her gaze and said quietly, "There is no us," and that sentence hit harder than anything else I had said because it was final, it was real, and she took a step back like it physically hurt her, and Marcus's voice came again, lower now, "You didn't have to do this here," and I turned to him and replied, "You didn't have to do this at all," and he didn't respond because there was nothing left to say, nothing left to hide, and I lowered my phone, looking around the room at the faces filled with shock, judgment, silence, and I said, "I trusted her, completely," and my voice stayed calm, steady, even as my chest tightened slightly, and she used that trust to plan my downfall, and Olivia shook her head again, tears falling now. "That's not true," and I asked softly, "Then what is?" And she opened her mouth but no words came out because there were none left, no lies strong enough to cover this, no excuses left to hide behind, and I watched her for a moment longer before stepping back, putting distance between us and saying quietly, "I'm done," and the room stayed silent, no one moving, no one speaking because the truth had already done its work, and Olivia's voice broke as she said, "Jason, please," and I didn't answer, not because I didn't hear her, but because there was nothing left to say, and Marcus stood there, tense, silent, exposed, and for the first time I didn't feel like the man who had been betrayed, I felt like the man who had taken everything back, and as Olivia's shoulders shook and her voice cracked under the weight of everything collapsing around her, I simply stood there, calm, still, and silent, because sometimes silence says everything that words never could. "I'm not coming back," I said quietly as I stood in the doorway, my hand resting on the frame for a second longer than necessary, and Olivia's voice trembled behind me, "Jason, please just listen," and I closed my eyes briefly before replying, "I've listened enough," and I stepped outside, the air feeling different, lighter, like something heavy had finally lifted, and she followed me a few steps and said, "We can fix this," and I turned slightly, not fully facing her, and answered, "You had months to fix this," and she shook her head quickly, tears already falling. "I made mistakes, I know that, but we can start over," and I let out a slow breath and said, "You didn't make a mistake, you made a plan," and she went silent, and that silence said everything, and I added softly, "There's a difference," and I walked away before she could say anything else because I didn't need more words, not from her, not anymore. And later that night, as I sat alone in my apartment, the same place that once felt like home, I looked around and said to myself, "This isn't loss, this is clarity," and my phone buzzed and I saw Sophia Lane's name and I answered, "It's done," and she replied calmly, "I heard," and I leaned back and said, "Everything's in motion," and she added, "Then the rest will follow," and I nodded slightly and said, "It already is," and she paused before asking, "How are you holding up?" And I thought about that for a moment before answering, "Better than I expected." And she said, "That's because you stopped reacting," and I replied, "I stopped trusting the wrong person," and she let out a quiet breath and said, "That's a start," and when the call ended I sat there in silence, not the heavy kind, not the painful kind, but something different, something steady, and over the next few days, everything unfolded exactly the way it was supposed to. Olivia's accounts were flagged, the transfers traced, the legal process moving forward without me needing to push. And one afternoon she called again, her voice broken. "Jason, I lost everything," and I closed my eyes for a second before replying, "You planned that," and she said, "Please, just talk to me," and I answered calmly, "There's nothing left to say," and she whispered, "I didn't think it would end like this," and I replied, "I didn't think you would do this," and there was a long pause before she said, "Marcus is gone," and I nodded slightly even though she couldn't see me and said, "Of course. He is," and she let out a small, shaky laugh. "He said it was too much," and I responded, "He was part of it, not built for the consequences," and she broke down completely then, her voice cracking, "I lost you," and I stayed silent for a moment before saying, "You gave me up a long time ago," and I ended the call before she could continue because I didn't need to hear more, not apologies, not regrets, Not anything that came too late, and days turned into weeks and slowly everything settled. My work stabilized, my mind cleared, and for the first time in a long time, I felt in control of my own life, not reacting, not chasing answers, just moving forward. And one evening as I sat across from Sophia Lane again, she looked at me and said, "You handled everything well," and I gave a small smile and replied, "I just stopped being the version of myself they expected." And she nodded slightly and said, "That's why you won." And I looked down at the table for a second before saying, "It doesn't feel like winning?" And she asked, "What does it feel like?" And I thought for a moment before answering, "Peace," and she smiled faintly and said, "That's better than winning." And we sat there for a moment, not saying anything, but it wasn't awkward, it was calm, natural, and I realized something then, not about her, not about anything new, but about myself, that I didn't need to rush into anything. I didn't need to fill the space Olivia left behind, because that space wasn't empty anymore, it was mine. And as I stood up to leave, Sophia said, "Take your time," and I nodded and replied, "I will." And as I walked outside, the city lights stretching out in front of me, I took a deep breath and said quietly, "I'm done looking back." And I meant it, because the version of me who kept asking questions, who kept doubting himself, who kept holding on to something that was already gone, that version didn't exist anymore. And as I reached my car, I paused for a moment, looking at my reflection in the window, and I said softly, "You made it through." And there was no anger in that moment, no bitterness, just clarity, just understanding. And I opened the door, sitting inside, my hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, and I added one final thought, one that felt stronger than everything else. Sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's the moment you take everything back.